What's up, party people? It is Carmen Chloe, and today we're going to talk about, on today's episode of Surviving Widowhood, we're going to talk about how to deal with your in-laws after widowhood. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Carmen Chloe of CarmenChloe.com and of SingleMarriedWidow.com. I'm a widowed mother of two, living life after death while building my global brand. So again, today we're going to talk about how to deal with your in-laws after widowhood. Now, I am a part of several groups on Facebook that are loss of spouse or widows with children, and there are so many different stories of how women got to widowhood, and so many different stories of how their interactions with their in-laws have been as a result. And I just wanted to touch on that because people love to say that when someone passes away, that's when you really see who people are. That's when you really see how people feel about you. That's when you really see people's true motives. And I have to say that is definitely true with the passing of my husband. Some things, some relationships that I had with certain of his family members are not the same after him passing. They're just simply not the same. And I can't say that I'm surprised to see how some of them turned out. Initially, I was a little hurt, but time and circumstances exposes all things. So if you're dealing with your in-laws and it's not really the best scenario during widowhood, I just want to give you some tips for how you can kind of navigate that. Now, there are some of my in-laws, some of the people who are my late husband's family, who our relationship has not changed because it was genuine from the beginning. And I definitely appreciate those relationships. And the ones that were altered were ones that I questioned a little bit in the beginning anyway. So it wasn't a surprise. It was more so like kind of hurtful. There were some of his family members that completely overstepped their boundaries in the natural as well as in the spiritual, completely overstepped my authority as his wife, completely just like disregarded the respect level and just the not obligation but the acknowledgement of me being his wife. And that it is what it is, it was what it was, and I know that God will deal with certain things accordingly. But it just was a really interesting lesson for me to see people exposed and to see people kind of come out of themselves. But I just want to give some tips on how you can deal with your in-laws if it's not an ideal situation post-widowhood. So number one is forgiveness, especially if you're a believer. Like, God calls us to forgive people. And I'm not saying it happens overnight. Like, I've had to pray like hard about certain situations that happen during the process of us laying my husband to rest. Afterwards, like people getting out of pocket and trying to access information that was not their right to have, and completely disregarding asking me if it was okay if they had it. Or so I had to pray really, really hard about certain scenarios and certain things that happened during my husband's whole burial and laying him to rest, and even afterwards I had to pray like, God, please clean my hands, purify my heart, help me to not have any ill feelings towards anybody. Because I don't know if you guys know, but if you're like upset with somebody and you're a believer and you pray the word of God, there is such a thing as praying witchcraft prayers, and you may be thinking you're in the right because you're angry and you want God to get this person and do this to that person. But you have to be very, very careful that your heart is pure and that your motives are pure and that you have asked God to teach you and show you how to forgive others. So I had to learn how to forgive people who to this day probably feel like they weren't even in the wrong at all. So number one is forgiveness, okay? Make sure to forgive people, even if they don't feel like they need to be forgiven for anything, even if they feel like they're not wrong for disregarding your authority as a wife, if they don't even feel like they're wrong for disrespecting you and not even taking consideration of your feelings and your thoughts and what it is that you wanted or agreed with or didn't agree with as a wife. So number one is forgiveness, okay? Number two is perspective. A lot of times when people pass away, like, everybody's hurt, they're in their feelings, and you're not seeing things clearly. So, try to see things from other people's perspectives. I know a lot of people acted out of their feelings and their emotions and their relationship that they had with my late husband, whether it was, whether they were out of line, whether they were overstepping their boundaries, whether they were interrupting or interfering with the covenant that we had under God. Like, a lot of people were just simply acting out of pure raw emotions, and I had to see it from that perspective. Well, they had this relationship with him, so this is probably why they're acting that way, even though they're completely and totally out of line, naturally and spiritually. But you just have to see things sometimes from different people's perspectives to kind of get an idea of, like, well, why would they do that? Or why would they feel like that was okay? Or why would they feel like they didn't even have to ask me if I felt comfortable with that? Because there were a lot of things that happened that had me feeling like straight up violated. Like, why would you not ask me that? Or why would you ask me this? So perspective, just kind of look at things from different people's perspectives, because again, when people pass away, people act out of emotion, they act out of feelings, they act out of hurt, they act out of shock, and then some of them just straight up act out of what they got going on the inside of them before anything ever happened. And then number 3 is peace. Make sure that you protect your peace, especially as a widow, because as much as people loved my late husband and had different relationships with them, like, my loss and my children's loss was the greatest loss of all. And just processing that and just completely shifting to an entirely different way of life was something that greatly affected me. And I had to get to a place to where I focused on creating peace for me and my children. I had to create peace at all costs. When you think about creating peace, especially in widowhood and the days after and in your journey afterwards, you want to make sure that you create boundaries, okay? Create boundaries around your peace. Create boundaries so that people don't feel comfortable violating you the way that they may have done directly after your husband passing or during the funeral or even after. You have to create boundaries, okay? Sometimes you have to create separation. You have to separate, like completely separate yourself from certain people for a certain amount of time or for a season. And then you may have to sever ties completely with some people if that means protecting your peace and protecting your children and making sure that while you're vulnerable and going through the grief process, that you're not exposing yourself or your children to people whose motives you have to question, whose intentions you have to question. And then that's basically it. Those are my tips for how to deal with your in-laws after widowhood, especially when it's a non-ideal situation. Number 1 was forgiveness, okay? Because, like, you got to make sure your hands are clean and your heart is pure and that your intentions are right, regardless of what anybody else has going on, regardless of what type of spirits and demons other people are dealing with within themselves. You have to make sure that your hands are clean so that you're not in error, especially when you go to God and you want him to move on your behalf. Number 2 is perspective. Make sure you have the right perspective, a fresh perspective. Make sure you're able to see things from different perspectives and not just your own. And then number 3 is peace. Protect your peace at all costs. I have gotten to the point to where if I have to cut people completely off to create a sanctuary of peace for me and my children, that is exactly what I will do, and that is what I have done for certain people. So those are just my tips. If you are trying to figure out how to survive widowhood and you have children, definitely check out my website, singlemarriedwidow.com. If you know any widows, please direct them to my website. It's a safe place. We have a community on Facebook, a safe space for widows, where you can vent, where you can talk about your frustrations, where you can talk about things that nobody else would understand except for other widows. Again, this is Carmen Chloe. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.